I was born right in the middle of the 90s, 2 years after my brother. All the memories of our childhood were kept on VHS tapes. Tapes that we hadn't watched in almost 2 decades. Because, well, who still owns a VHS player? My brother Luke would soon turn 30. And I thought it would be a neat present to digitize all our old videos. My mom kept them inside a box in our basement, labeled 1993 to 1999 A tapes. I had no idea what that meant until I found the others. Our old basement was filled with all sorts of both junk and memorabilia of the past years. Dusty basketballs with no air, our old inflatable pool, sneakers I could still wear if I gave them a decent clean. I got lost in there for hours, looking through all kinds of stuff until I stumbled upon the box that looked just like the first one I found, except this one was hidden under a pile of old jackets, the same year's B tapes. At that point, I obviously had no idea what the difference between them was, and my parents weren't home, so I couldn't ask them. They'd gone on a cruise. I'd let myself in with the key I'd kept after moving out, so I brought both of them to my car. It took a week after I could pick up both boxes and a USB stick with all the videos from the shop. I watched the first few, the ones in which I wasn't even born yet, just to check if everything worked fine. Then I put the stick into an envelope with a card so our family could watch them together after Luke's birthday and after my parents got back. 2 days after the party, my brother called me. He didn't tell me what was going on but commanded me to come over to his house as soon as possible. I'd never heard my brother sound more disturbed. What the actual hell, Max? My brother looked even taller than he was. Anger seemed to make him grow. I was a good bit shorter than him, paler and weaker. My dark hair was curly and chaotic. His was always styled right and had the color of honey. The only similarity we had were our greenish-brownish eyes. I watched that stuff with Ellie. You think that's appropriate for a 2-year-old? Can you at least let me inside before you start harassing me? I have no idea what you're talking about. He moved to the side. Their living room was a mess with toys, clothes, and crumbles everywhere. It had been like that ever since they got Ellie. It made me like my niece even more, bringing a bit of chaos into my brother's sleek life. Are Ellie and Jacob not home? He shook his head. They went to Jacob's parents. He's pretty angry with you, he sighed. Max, be honest. Why did you make those videos? How did you even? I moved a stuffed elephant from the sofa and sat down. I brought our old VHS tapes to a place, and I told you when I gave it to you. I thought you'd like to see them. Luke frowned. You look like you have no idea what I'm talking about. He got his laptop and sat down next to me. He opened a folder with 2 video files labeled Tapes A and Tapes B. Did you watch them? A few of the first ones. I nodded. Without saying anything else, he opened file B. A video started playing. The date at the bottom said November 1994 with the description park time. It started off with a dark screen, I thought at first, but as it turned out it was just night. The quality wasn't great, but you could tell there were trees, and you could hear the occasional howl of an owl. There is a similar video. In the first ones, it's me, I just learned how to walk, and we're in the park, having a picnic, during daytime. So what is this? I asked. Wait, suddenly there was light. Somebody had lit a torch and shoved it into the ground. You couldn't tell who the person was because they only showed the back and it was still too dark. More torches followed, arranged in a circle. When it was done, someone came with a child that looked a lot like Luke when he was little and placed the baby in the middle of the circle. Even with the light, it still looked strange and blurry. There were voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. What the hell? I whispered. I was speechless and sick. Watching these hurt my insides, and I can't explain how or why. It felt as if it was too unnatural for us to comprehend, a sort of filter that lay over it, the sounds. I wanted it to stop, but at the same time, I was too curious. Luke looked at me with a concerned look on his face. I'm gonna fast forward to one with you in it. June 1997 birthday. This one was during the daytime, in our garden, but things looked slightly different again. Colors were much brighter, almost neon. 2 boys appeared in the frame, probably Luke and me. It must have been my 3rd birthday, so Luke was 5. We were dressed in purple striped shirts and pants but could only see our backs. We were running towards something that looked like a small bouncy castle, one that I don't remember ever having. We disappeared inside of it, and the camera zoomed out further and further, and then all you could hear were loud screams, but they didn't sound like they were coming from children. When the two of us came outside again, the camera was still zoomed out, but you could still see that we were laughing and jumping, and there was something red staining our clothes and hands. Blood. I ran to the bathroom and threw up my lunch. When I got back, Luke was waiting for me with a bottle of water. Happened to Ellie as well. Kept throwing up but also cried a lot. I didn't like the idea that my tiny little niece saw that, and I found it strange that she had such a strong reaction to it as well. How she understood that something was wrong, because technically nothing really bad happened in those tapes. They were just disturbing. Luke, I swear, I have no idea what that was. All I did was grab the boxes with tapes. Do you remember that birthday? He asked. Are you joking? We went back to the living room. Luke had closed the laptop. I remember your third birthday. Some of your kindergarten friends were there. Mom baked a cake. There was no bouncy castle, and whatever else the hell that was. My stomach was still turning. I've watched plenty of far more gory stuff in my life. I have no idea why this affected me so much. Mom and Dad come back tomorrow. We need to talk to them, I said in a determined tone. But Luke knew me well, and probably heard the fear in my voice. I'd never been scared of my parents before as far as I could remember, but I also know that they'd been slightly particular when we were growing up. My parents had always been kind of eccentric. Our house was always full of strange art, and they traveled all the time. Even then, they never hurt us. If anything, they neglected us a little. But I didn't remember anything scary ever happening. I can go alone. Look, Mom and Dad are a bit weird. It's probably some very strange art project of theirs. But either way, I want to know what's up with that, Luke said. No, I'll come too. Maybe they'll be angry that we found them. Max, they kept them in the basement, in an unlocked box. They wanted us to find them, or at least they didn't mind if we did. I wasn't exactly afraid of my parents, but of all the things I couldn't remember, I stayed with Luke that night. Jacob and Ellie were still with Jacob's parents. The next day, we drove to our old childhood home. Luke and I had both stayed in our hometown. After moving out, this house was a 20-minute drive from my parents. I lived a bit further away from both. When we reached the driveway, I saw my parents' car and felt a cold shiver. I wasn't sure how we should do this, what we would say. As it turns out, I didn't have to. Mom opened the door before we even rang the bell. Max, Lukey, how sweet of you to stop by. She came closer to hug us, but Luke gently pushed her away. Where's Dad? The four of us need to talk. Before my mom could answer, he marched to the living room where my dad was reading a book. What the hell are the B-tapes? My parents exchanged a glance. They didn't even try to act like they had no idea. Sit down, both of you, and calm down. It's nothing bad, my mom said. My dad sighed and put his book away. Then he got up. If anything, they looked annoyed that we disturbed their day. Luke and I sat next to each other on the sofa, and my parents were standing in front of us. For a moment it felt like we were little boys again, getting in trouble for breaking something. Neither of you ever got hurt. We made them for a possibility, one that you didn't even get. My father said, "Can you please talk less cryptic?" I chimed in. It was the first thing I'd said. Those aren't real videos of your childhood, just remakes for your audition tapes. They were searching for child stars. Luke didn't make the cut. And then we tried with you, Max, but neither of you were chosen. My mother took over. Who are they? And chosen for what? A movie? Luke asked. My parents exchanged another glance. Something like that. The filmmakers were looking for extraordinary children with specific instructions on how to show their personalities. The children that were chosen became part of this fantastic kids show, but neither of you were. Now Luke and I exchanged a look. I had all those questions. Why would you do that to children that young? Why did you never tell us about it? And why did those tapes make us sick? But the atmosphere shifted after my parents explained it to us. Mom went to the kitchen and started cooking. Dad was blabbering about their trip. They acted like what he had seen was totally normal. That was the scariest part. How normal they thought those tapes were when they could even make a 2-year-old sick. I felt like I didn't even know my own parents, and I felt strangely out of place. Meanwhile, Luke looked like he would explode any second. Finally, he shot me a look and walked outside. I followed and we drove off without saying another word to my parents. At first, neither of us were speaking. I suppose we both didn't know how to deal with the situation. After a while, Luke parked next to a McDonald's. I thought he was just getting some food, but instead, he turned to me with a serious look. "There's something you don't know. When you were sleeping last night, I watched a few more of the tapes. I mean, they made me feel terrible. But I had to know if anything, really bad happened." I swallowed and Luke took a deep breath. Then he shook his head. "There was nothing like that. The tapes are messed up, but in different ways. In ways that make you question reality." Okay, now he was looking straight at me. "You know how Mom said neither of us made the cut to be cast?" I nodded. "Well, after 1996 there was a third child in the tapes. And the more I think about it, the more I'm starting to remember things. I know it sounds insane, but I'm wondering if we had another sibling that we forgot. I'm your family, okay? That's all that matters." I nodded, but the sinking feeling inside my stomach hadn't gone away. I'd asked Luke to drop me off at home. Jacob and Ellie were coming back from Jacob's parents, and I needed some alone time. I'd taken the USB stick with me. I had a feeling Luke would obsess about it, and that wouldn't be healthy for him or his family. I, on the other hand, was single and lived alone. I had all the time and energy to go crazy. Luke put his hand on my shoulder. "I mean, I know all of this feels strange, but let's be honest. Mom and Dad have always been a little insane." He tried to smile, but I saw a twitch in his eye. He knew he was losing control, but tried his best to keep me calm. I was 28 years old, and my brother still wanted to protect me. Even after moving out at only 17, he always stayed close and made sure we kept in touch. It made me wonder how much of the bad things in our childhood he hid from me. Older siblings really don't have it easy sometimes. "Luke, I'm fine," I said, "but I might take a little break from visiting Mom and Dad for a while, just to wrap my head around things." As to the third child, "Look, no, Max, I think I let my imagination roll. That kid could have just been a neighbor or a friend's child. Oh, yeah, for sure. I still don't like that they used us for some weird audition like that. Never thought Mom and Dad were fame seekers." I nervously laughed. "Yeah, same, but try not to worry about it too much, okay?" But of course, I did, just like him. We were stupid. My brother was trying to protect me and I was trying to protect him. But in reality, both of us were already too deep into the mystery, and neither of us would let go of it. As soon as I heard Luke's car drive off, I grabbed my laptop. There were two things I needed to do. First, I would start with the first tapes to see if there was another child in there with us. Second, I would watch enough of the B tapes to understand a little bit better what they were about. The first thing made me nervous, the second made me ill. As I skipped through the first tape's file, I realized something. All the memories I had of my childhood came from what was filmed back then. I suppose it's not that odd. Our brains aren't that evolved yet as kids. We mix the information we have with bits of memory and believe that we actually remember it all. It was all fairly normal. A trip to the zoo, birthday parties, school plays. I kept skipping until I reached 1996, a short fragment of Christmas, with me, Luke, my parents, some other adults, and a baby. I didn't recognize those other adults. It might have been one of their kids, but my mom was holding it. I paused the tape right there and switched to the B file to look for the same date, December 1996. Even while I was just skipping through scenes, my stomach rumbled. I still didn't understand how it was possible. A few images and sounds couldn't possibly evoke such a physical reaction. Maybe it was just my nervous system warning me about something. I tightened my fist and continued. No puking before I had some answers. 1996, Lee's first Christmas. It was set at a graveyard. It must have been evening time, somewhere in between light and dark, but the contrast kept changing, making it difficult to focus on any specifics. Then two gravestones came into the frame, but I couldn't decipher the names or dates, although one of them seemed to say Montreux, our last name. I swallowed and kept watching. An adult I couldn't identify brought the child into the frame. Lee, I guessed, and the adult could have been my dad, although it was hard to say. He laid the baby down on the ground in front of the gravestones. All of a sudden, the light became crazy bright, almost burning my eyes. I looked away for a second, and the image had changed. What I saw now was our family. Mom, Dad, Luke, me, and Lee. We were sitting on a blue sofa, and behind us stood a red Christmas tree. It seemed as if all the colors were reversed. Luke and I kept moving and looking in all kinds of directions. But Mom, Dad, and Lee were staring right into the camera. No movement. Mom and Dad were both grinning. They almost looked proud. Then, Dad's face turned serious, and the video stopped. My heart was racing. There is no show or movie I could ever imagine who would want this as an audition tape, but I'd known that from the first few ones already. Somehow I still tried to find a logical explanation though, a reason why my parents were doing this. Yes, they'd been weird sometimes, but they were still my parents. I didn't want to believe that there was something utterly wrong with them, or imagine the kind of horrible people they were involved with. At this point, I believed it to be some sort of satanic cult. My head joined my fast racing heart. It felt like something would break out of my skull any second, so I closed the B file. When the Christmas video of the first file opened up, I watched a little more of it. It felt ironic, but almost comforting to watch that regular-looking Christmas. Luke and I were playing with presents, the adults were drinking and laughing, and then I saw a familiar face that didn't look as happy as the rest. My grandpa. I don't know why I hadn't thought about that before. My grandparents moved away when we were really young, and not long after that my parents broke off contact with them, or the other way around. We didn't even go to my grandmother's funeral. I took a picture and sent it to Luke. He called me back an hour later, his first words being I found him. Who? What do you think? Grandpa. He lives in a nursing home in a place called Watton. I thought, Luke, whoa, stop. You found Grandpa. How? I could hear him grinning through the phone. He has Facebook. I was quiet for a second. Did you text him? No, I thought we might pay him a visit. I looked up the town he lives in. It's a 4-hour drive. I already took time off work. Maybe you could say you're sick, or I didn't even think about it. Yeah, okay, let's do it. What does Jacob think of all this? I asked the next day as we were sitting in the car. Luke didn't answer for a while. I didn't tell him everything. Said the video was a strange art project of our parents, and that I'm in a fight with them about it, and about you leaving for 2 days, visiting our grandpa, who we haven't seen in 2 decades. I didn't question him further. It was his relationship, not mine, and it was probably for the best if fewer people got involved in this mess. We arrived at the nursing home around noon. A friendly nurse guided us to the garden, where an old man was sitting on a bench. I knew it had to be my grandfather, but it was strange to see how much he had aged, especially after I'd seen him in the video only the day before being more than 25 years younger. All of a sudden I started getting nervous. The last time this man had seen us we were children. He probably wouldn't even recognize us, and I didn't know how clear he still was in his head. As we approached, he looked up and smiled. Lee, he called as he looked at me. No, Mr. Montreux, this is your other grandson, the nurse calmly said. It's Luke and Max, Grandpa. Do you remember us? His expression changed immediately. At first, I thought it was anger, then disappointment, and finally sadness. Luke and I were lost for words. We had planned all the things we would say and ask during our drive, but now my mind was blank, and from the appearance so was his. Grandpa gave us a sad smile. You boys have grown so much. Luke, you more than your brother, but still. Which brother? Luke asked bluntly. Max or Lee? Grandpa shot him a confused look. He slips in and out. At times his mind is sharp, but often it is more foggy, the nurse explained. Great, Luke mumbled. I'm gonna go inside and let you chat. I'm sure you missed your grandkids very much, Mr. Montreux, the nurse said in a friendly tone. No, don't leave me alone with him, Grandpa said, as he looked at Luke, who was just as confused as I was. Do you happen to have a phone number or any other contact information from his other grandson? I asked the nurse. She shook her head. Unfortunately not. He brought him here a little while back and he comes to visit at times, but it's hard to reach him, all because of that silly show, Grandpa whispered. I got closer and sat down next to him. He didn't seem to mind me. The show he was cast for? I asked, gently placing my hand on his shoulder. He looked me in the eyes and nodded. I didn't know it would follow him like that. Back then, I didn't know. He shouted that last part, and I instinctively removed my hand. Mr. Montreux, all is fine. Lee is doing well, the nurse calmly spoke. I'm sorry, boys, but I think now is not a good time for him. She helped Grandpa get up from the bench but before he was standing, he looked at me. Not your brother, your cousin. I raised that boy after. He didn't finish the sentence, but instead looked at the ground and sadly whispered, your parents should have died, not his. So what now? I asked when we were back in the car. Luke let out a big sigh. We need to find Lee, who I guess is our cousin, and not brother, so at least that's something. Maybe we can ask around and see if someone knows him. The town isn't that big, and he was some kind of child star apparently. I looked through the window at the gray buildings we were passing on our way to the town center. Did you see the look on his face when he said our parents should have died? I asked. Luke nodded. They were probably the reason Lee got cast. After they didn't want us, they tried with him instead. Maybe after his parents died. You don't think Dad killed one of his siblings and spouse to get their child for a TV show, do you? I asked. Half jokingly, Luke opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again. After a while, he said, can you text Jacob and let him know we arrived? I forgot. Sure, I said, quickly followed by damn. This shouldn't have made me feel so scared. But I knew something bad was about to happen. He sent you a text 1 hour ago. Your parents just randomly stopped by. You know how much I hate when they do that. Luke's eyes opened wide. Call him, now, he shouted. I gulped. It's going straight to mailbox. I'm going to kill them. With the speed Luke was driving in, we'd get back home in half the time we were supposed to. But I couldn't blame him. With the most recent news, I wouldn't be surprised if my parents were already working on Ellie's audition tape. We don't know that day. I stopped to think over my words. This happened decades ago. I doubt whatever production company that was, it still exists today. Maybe they just wanted to stop by, and that's why none of them are picking up their phones. Luke hissed back. He was right. At this point, we couldn't know what my parents were capable of. We both stayed silent for a while. They were alive and healthy, and from what I sounded like, so was Lee, but I'd still evolved a fear for my parents and lost all the respect. I remember them, Luke said all of a sudden. Who? Lee's parents, our aunt, Dad's sister, and her husband. I swallowed. Why was Luke only giving me truths in small portions? Before I could ask precisely that, he continued. I'd forgotten. Repressed it, I guess. But I'm starting to remember their funeral now. That's strange. The only adults there were Mom, Dad, Dad's parents, and one woman I don't know. You're trying to tell me you forgot an actual funeral until now? I asked, fed up with being left in the dark by everyone in my family. If I had to go through this mess, I at least wanted to understand it. Yes, Max, geez, I'm not trying to mess with you. I don't get it either. I was a child too when it happened. The memories are fuzzy, and I forgot until Grandpa talked about it. I had told you that I'd started remembering the third child, didn't I? Yes, I mumbled. At the same time, I kept trying to reach someone. Mom, Dad, Jacob. Maybe we should call the police, I asked after a while. I don't know why I didn't think about that before. It almost felt as if the outside world and authorities didn't exist. Luke shook his head. We don't know how unpredictable Mom and Dad are. I need to talk to them. Yeah, okay. Luke started nervously tapping the driver's wheel. What's the first memory that you ever had? He asked. Like, the very first thing you ever remember. I thought about it for a while. It's hard to say because, as I mentioned earlier, most of my memories were mixed with what I saw in the tapes, in the regular ones. I'm not sure, I said, although I did have one very early memory that I was sure was not from the tapes. It's one of me and Luke. We were at home. It was night. Back then we still shared a room. There was a lot of shouting coming from outside. He came over to my bed and closed my ears with his hands, but I couldn't say if it was real or if my mind had fabricated it. And Luke was already on edge with everything, so I didn't tell him. Instead, I told him about something else I remembered, which I now think could have a meaning. I remember a man visiting us once, a weird man. He was dressed in purple and yellow and had a very shrill voice. Luke bit his lip, the same way he already did as a kid when we were playing board games, and he thought thoroughly about his next move. We were wearing those same colors in that birthday video, he said. I nodded, but it couldn't have been around the same time. You were too young in that tape. What's your first memory? I asked him. Your birth. I think I was happy. We didn't talk much for the next hour or so. We were both lost in thought. I was trying to remember as much as I could from my childhood, and I think Luke was doing the same. His expression darkened more and more the longer he was silent. I had to ask him about more of his memories, but I decided to do it later, after he got his daughter back and knew that she was safe. As we finally pulled into the driveway of our old childhood home, we discussed our game plan. We'd start normal and calm. We'd let ourselves in with my key. We wouldn't shout or cause any trouble, but act like nothing was up. Mom and Dad had no idea what we'd been up to or how much we knew. Before we could do any of that, Mom got in the way though. She'd already opened the door as we approached with a bright smile on her face. "Boys, you're back, and just in time as well. We were just sitting down for dinner. How are you acting this normal?" I blurted out, forgetting that we'd planned to do the same thing, and that Mom hadn't been with us these past hours. She had no idea about all the disaster scenarios that were going through our heads. She answered me in the shape of an eye roll. "You're so dramatic, Max. Sometimes I really wonder why you weren't picked. Maybe if you were better." She stopped herself by clenching her fist. "Unimportant," she continued. "Come in." Luke shoved her to the side and shot through the door. I quickly followed, leaving the door open behind me. Our home has an open design with few doors, so you can quickly skim through the kitchen and living room. There was no one around. "Where are they?" Luke shouted. "Not up here." Mom shook her head and pointed her fingers down. "Stay here," Luke said as he walked towards the basement. Mom quickly followed him, making small jumps with each step. Ignoring my brother's instructions, I went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and followed them to the basement. Of course, I had absolutely no idea what to expect down there, but at the end of the day, it was my family, and at the very least, I wouldn't leave my brother alone. They had redecorated the basement. All the boxes with stuff were shoved in one corner. In the middle of the room was a table, our old garden table probably, with an orange plastic cloth that had balloons on it. The table was set with plates, cups, and napkins, all in sets of 6. In the middle there was a big plate with one of those huge silver covers that you sometimes see in hotels and movies, or maybe in real ones too. My dad was sitting on a small plastic chair. Mom stood next to him. "Where are they?" Luke shouted. Mom and Dad shot each other a look. "Too, I'm not playing. Where are they?" "If you're talking about our son-in-law and our granddaughter, they went home around 10 minutes ago after Jacob helped us set everything up," my father explained calmly. "Our basement consists of 2 rooms, the big one that we were standing in at that moment, and a smaller one connected by a closed door." I walked towards it, but Mom got in my way. My hands went to the knife that I had hidden in my back pocket. "You're telling me Jacob helped you with? What the hell even is this?" Luke wasn't shouting anymore, but his voice had a low tremble. Even with parents like ours, family normally means safety. The situation was absurd, and quite frankly frightening. It didn't feel like reality anymore. Everything seemed to happen ultra fast, and simultaneously, in slow motion. "It's a surprise party. Don't act like we can't talk to our son-in-law. Jacob loves us." "No, he doesn't," Luke hissed. "And we love our little Ellie. She was playing the whole time." "Luke, honey, call him if you don't believe us." Now Luke was moving towards us, stopping dangerously close in front of Mom. "We've been trying to call him for hours," I chimed in, but at the same time I remembered that there was never any service down in the basement. "Luke, go upstairs and try to call him." I gave him a look that meant that I was fine down here. He hesitated for a second but then ran up. As soon as he was gone, the eyes of my parents were glued to me. Both had massive grins on their faces, and then shouted, "Revival time." Dad got up and led me to the table, gesturing for me to take a seat. "Stop this madness now. Why are you doing this to us?" My voice cracked, tears shooting to my eyes. I had finally reached the point where I just felt hurt. Mom started stroking my hair the way she used to when I was little. We didn't do anything. You did this, Max, when you couldn't perform well enough," she said. "What?" They didn't answer, but started rearranging things on the table until we heard Luke coming down the stairs. They're both home, and completely fine. First, he had no service, and then his battery was dead. "Come on, Max, let's go." "No," Mom shouted. "Not yet. You wanted answers, right? And we want to have dinner with you. If you stay, we will talk," Dad added. Luke and I exchanged another look, and then, to my surprise, my brother proceeded to sit down. This was our family after all. My mother sat down, took a deep breath, and started speaking. "Shortly after Luke was born, friends of ours told us about an upcoming project, a television show for children on the surface, but so much more below that, an opportunity to change everything in this world. But the project was only at the start. It would take more than a decade to evolve completely, which was perfect. We had all this time to prepare and become a part of it. The company behind it sent us instructions regularly, little clips we were supposed to film of Luke, and when Max was born, of him too. But my mother stopped speaking, disappointment written on her face. Neither of you made the cut, my father continued. He didn't seem to be right enough. But then little Lee was born. We babysat him at times and took some footage. They loved him. My mother took over again. When his parents died, she said with no emotion in her voice, we were sad of course, but also thrilled because we thought we could adopt him. But your awful grandparents took him away from us. Mom and Dad now looked at each other and smiled. In unison they spoke, but it didn't matter. He was cast, and when the show was ready, they would find him and a way to get him on it. He was 11 when it started, and everything went perfectly. We even watched the show with you a few times. We wanted it to be you boys, but at least little Lee was family. Luke and I looked at each other, more confused than ever. Our parents had officially lost their minds. Can we talk now? I asked. Screw it, I will, because you're not giving us real answers. You're making the situation only weirder. What's up with this creepy-ass child's birthday dinner? Why are there 6 sets of dishes? They both grinned. Because we have fantastic news. There will be a reboot. My father almost screamed. Luke's eyes shot open. You're not doing any of this stuff with Ellie. Do you hear me? I'll get both of you arrested. They both shook their heads. No, she's much too young. The new show will start very soon this time, my mom said. The thing is, the show has an adult protagonist, and the last one recently died. Isn't that fantastic? Luke got up and called out, I'm done. Both of you need psychiatric help. If you're ready for that, I might contemplate talking to you again. I moved up as well, following him toward the door, but then he stopped all of a sudden. Wait a second. The show, it's that Adventure Time thing, isn't it? Both my parents smiled again and nodded. Didn't Max run away after watching that? What? I asked, but before I could get an answer, we were interrupted by the sound of a loud thump coming from the room next to this one. I heard a low voice whispering help. Who's in there? I shouted. My father answered. Our star. I woke up in a cold sweat after a dream that felt far too vivid to be a construct of my mind. My surroundings were pitch black, but I smelled pine cones and trees all around me. It didn't matter that I couldn't see much. I knew I had to keep going. There was something waiting for me, or someone. Nobody had seen me leave. I climbed out of the window. I was afraid, but I didn't stop walking. It was as if I was being controlled by external forces. Suddenly 2 arms grabbed me from behind. Not you. They promised you would be safe. My mother whispered. I had forgotten about this experience, possibly because I wasn't entirely myself when it happened. My mother brought me back home, where a police car was already waiting. They'd been looking for me for hours. She'd saved me, but back then I didn't know from what. This must have been more than 15 years ago. Now I know that I was following my cousin's call. Do you have some water? The unfamiliar voice pulled me back to reality. I still hadn't fully grasped the events of the last day. Luke and I had talked to my parents, who seemed like they were going through some sort of manic episode. Now, I was in a hotel, and my brother and his family were in the room next to me, and I was here with my cousin. No, but I can get you some from the sink in the bathroom. He looked miserable. His eyes were bloodshot, and his dark hair, which resembled mine, was going in all directions. He was lying in the bed while I was sitting on the sofa. I must have dozed off on it sometime early this morning. He slowly nodded. Luke had been hesitant about leaving me here with him, but I convinced him that after being drugged and tied up in our basement room, he was probably lacking the energy to hurt me. Besides, we were the ones who got him out, and not without paying a high price. I still have the look on my father's face ingrained into my mind when he said that our star was next door. His eyes opened wider than they humanly should be able to. His grin was so bright that I thought the corners of his mouth might rip. The excitement quickly wore off, however, after I'd pulled the knife from behind my back. It might have been a rash reaction, but for whatever goddamned reason, I chose fight at that moment instead of flight. Max, stay calm, Luke whispered, but I couldn't. My entire body was shaking, and then the most surprising thing happened. My mother started laughing, hysterically, then slowly she got up from the tiny plastic chair she was sitting on all while still laughing, and then my father chimed in and laughed even harder. For a split second, I almost believed that my entire family was playing a prank on me, but then my mother started talking. Leave the show for the producer, dear. She'll be here soon. I even give you permission to slit my throat, she said with tears in her eyes. Were you fathers? But it should at least be taped. Honey, I was frozen and almost didn't realize that my father had been walking up to me, his hands reaching for the knife, until Luke jumped in and punched my father in the face, something I never believed I would witness. My father, who had grown old over the years, fell back, and for a moment I felt pity. Even after all they'd revealed about themselves, I still felt bad for them. I still felt attached to them. After the punch, things were going really fast. Luke had taken the knife from my hand and was shouting at my mother to stay back. He walked up to my dad, but instead of helping him up, he grabbed the keys that he had tied to his belt. He threw them over to me, but of course, they fell to the ground. That's when I unfroze. I grabbed the keys and tried a few until one fit the other door in the basement. Inside lay Lee, falling in and out of unconsciousness. It was immediately clear to me that it was him because my grandpa was right. We looked very alike. Luke shouted some more things at my parents and helped me pick up our cousin. Together we carried him upstairs. My parents didn't move, but as we walked up the stairs, I heard my father say, "You're making a mistake. They will find you." We were on our way to a hospital when Lee started waking up more and more. He begged us not to go to the hospital, but instead to drive to some hotel as far away as possible. Luke didn't question him. After picking up a clueless Jacob and Ellie, we were on the road. On the drive there, Luke tried his best to explain everything to Jacob. He left out some parts which I assume was because of Lee. "So, I suppose they used us as bait. They said they wanted to plan something for your birthday. Recreate a party they had when you were kids or something. I shouldn't have gone along. Jacob said after he had been silent for a long time, probably processing the insane story. "I can't believe what you guys have been through," he continued with a hurt undertone, either because Luke had kept this from him, or because he genuinely felt bad for us. When we reached the hotel, Lee immediately passed out on the bed. I sat down on the sofa, making sure he kept breathing while listening to Luke's and Jacob's muffled voices next door. But now Lee was awake, finally, because we hadn't been able to ask him much, and I was damn ready for some answers. After texting Luke, the three of us were sitting on the bed, almost as if we were just boys, cousins, hanging out. But I didn't even remember this cousin. To me, he was a stranger. "I swear everything is getting a bad reboot. Even our murder show," Lee casually said after a while. "How can you be joking right now?" Luke asked. He shrugged. "You get desensitized after a while. Can you tell us more about this show?" I asked. "Do you want the short or the long version?" "Maybe start with short," I said, getting nervous. He shrugged. "I don't remember much about my parents' death or life before it, to be honest. I don't remember either of you, and I didn't even know you existed. I grew up with Grandma and Grandpa. When I was 11 or so, I saw an ad looking for actors for a new TV show. No idea why, but for some reason I thought that was exactly what I wanted to do." He sighed. "I thought there was no way I'd ever get cast. I was some kid from some boring-ass small town. Grandpa took me to auditions. He had no clue what this was about, and for some reason, I actually got the part. Everything else from that time is kind of foggy. There were a couple of other kids who I recently got back in touch with, and some dude named Worley." Luke and I stayed silent, listening to every word. "The next part might seem a little absurd to you." He took a deep breath. "This show had an awful effect on kids. After watching it, they would run away from home. It was some kind of sick mind control from the production company. I know this sounds insane, but they took all those kids. I don't know how many of them died." He looked at us, waiting for a reaction, probably thinking that we wouldn't believe a word, but we'd seen the tapes and had felt the effect they had. "Did you ever go to the police?" He shook his head. "No, and I suggest you don't either. The risk is too high that they will just send you to the producers. They have powers you can't possibly imagine." "But our parents said that the adult in the show is dead." "That's Worley, right?" Luke asked. "Doesn't matter. He didn't matter. They can kill and replace any one of us. To be honest, I don't believe there is anything they cannot do, and running away from them is next to impossible. A while back, my friends and I had a terrible encounter with them, and then again, but we were able to fight them. Now for a while, I thought I was fine, but it never seems to end. And now they somehow got my uncle to lure me back in. I got up from the bed and started pacing around the room. How the hell did my parents get you into our basement? I asked. He looked at the ground. I don't have any family left besides Grandpa. When they reached out to me, I had no idea that they were connected to Worley, that they were insane. He took another long breath. Look, I can tell you everything else I know about this, but first, I need to know how you are all connected to this. Luke and I exchanged a look, one that said, can we trust him? But then I thought about it. We could have been the ones in his place. We were lucky they chose him instead. Luke must have been thinking the same because, after some silence, my brother started speaking and told Lee everything that had happened after we watched the tapes. When Luke was done, we both looked at Lee. He had been quiet all throughout, but now he opened his mouth to speak. So this didn't start with the auditions. It has been determined since I was a baby, and your parents knew everything. I guess, maybe yours did too, Luke said. Did you tell your parents before looking for the tapes, the regular ones? He asked, looking at me. I nodded. And you'd never seen the other ones before, so they probably planted them there for you to find. But why? He was scratching the stubbles on his face that didn't quite yet make a beard. Did you feel anything when you watched them? Yeah, they made me feel sick and overall a little strange, I said, my mind racing. I looked over at Luke, but he seemed frozen. Cold sweat was forming on his forehead. Lee sighed. If those tapes were made with some connection to the production company, they weren't normal. Watching them might do stuff to you and your mind. Maybe it already did. My guess is that your parents wanted you to see them, and we should find out why before it's too late for you. It had taken power over me once before, and I realized that it could happen again. Maybe it already had. But what I couldn't get out of my mind was that Mom had saved me back then. Why would she push us back in now? So, what should we be prepared for? Luke asked. Hard to say. I mean, if you can't trust your own mind, you just have to go with whatever you believe is real at the moment. There's no survival guide or anything like that. We just have to do our best and hope we survive, Lee said. Fantastic. Lee gave him a half smile. It helps not to be alone. I wouldn't have made it without my friends back then. You have each other, and that matters a lot. Well, for what it's worth, you have us as well. Our parents might be dicks, but we're here for you, Lee, my brother said. Besides, someone who's already been in hell knows how to survive it. I'm still feeling normal, at least I think so, I said. What about you, Luke? He started fumbling with his ring around his finger. Mostly normal, although I've never punched Dad before, and I never threatened our parents with a knife before. To be fair, they deserved that, Lee said, and the three of us laughed. For a moment, we really felt normal. Why do you think they chose you for the show? Why not Luke or me? I asked after a while. I'm not sure. Maybe because I was Alex's age. Who's Alex? Lee looked away. He was the main character next to Worley, the real star. Luke asked. Lee nodded. So why don't we get that guy? Maybe if they have. I don't know where he is. Lee interrupted with no further explanation. Luke started massaging his temples. I gotta go check on Jacob and Ellie. He gave me a look I didn't understand and walked outside. Do you know what happened to all those children that ran away from home? I asked Lee after a while. He smiled, but there was still some sadness in his eyes. They got to go home, although most of them weren't children anymore at that point. I bit my lip. The thought hadn't left my mind that I was almost one of them, and as hard as I tried to make my mind work, I couldn't remember more about that time. Is there a way we can see that show? I'd like to know. No, Lee interrupted again. We left no traces of it. And trust me, you do not want to see it, but I already have. Well, when I was younger, I was one of the kids, but I don't remember it. Lee looked me up and down. How old are you? He asked. 28. So you were 11 or 12 when Worley aired. Almost too old. He started rubbing his face again. Did your parents ever tell you that I was in it? I shook my head. You said that Worley is dead. Are you sure about that? I asked. He nodded and looked away again. I knew there was more to it. Lee looked like he'd been through a lot, and I could tell that he wasn't quite ready to open up about all the trauma, but he tried. The producer slit his throat in front of my eyes. That's when I realized this wasn't really about Worley. He was a pawn just like the rest of us. Damn, that producer lady really is ruthless. Lee frowned. Not a lady, a man. He was really charismatic too, which makes him even scarier. Are you sure he was the producer? My parents were talking about a woman. Maybe it's a new one. Maybe that's why it's starting again. I gotta make a phone call. Can I borrow your phone? He asked. I handed it over after checking if my parents had tried to contact us. Nothing. No calls. No texts. Lee walked out to the hallway, but came back seconds later. The door to your brother's room is open. I immediately jumped up and followed Lee to the room next to ours. It was empty, and on the white sheets was a red stain. Damn, I shouted Luke, but of course, there was no answer. Maybe they went downstairs to get some food, Lee asked, but he didn't sound very convincing. I shook my head. He would have told us. Maybe they left. Your brother seemed suspicious. Maybe he was scared for his daughter or... No, I whispered. Luke would never leave me alone. The hotel was empty. There was nobody behind the reception, no one in the lobby or the hallways. A massive building, simply wiped clean. A nagging feeling spread through my body, the feeling that we had missed a lot during the short night that we'd spent inside the rooms. It's starting. They are here. They must be, Lee whispered as he looked towards the front door. Give me my phone. I tried to reach Luke, but he didn't answer. I sent him a text, but of course, he didn't reply to that either. Something terrible was happening. We could leave. I don't see anybody outside. We could get weapons or reinforcements, Lee said and looked me in the eyes. After I didn't answer, he added, but you're not leaving, are you? He asked. I shook my head. I'm going to look for my brother. Alright, then I'm also staying. We're family, right? I wanted to trust Lee. I felt bad for him. All of this mess was my parents' fault. They were possibly even the reason that Lee was an orphan. Who else would have a better reason to mess with us? I was starting to think that Lee was doing just that, because when I tried to reach Luke, I saw a text that Lee had sent to a strange number. The message said it's not me, which I didn't understand, and our current location, but the message wasn't sent earlier. When he borrowed my phone, it was sent around 4 a.m., around the time I had dozed off. Staying with Lee might have been more dangerous than just going to look for Luke on my own. But right now I knew I needed him. He was the one they really wanted. After all, Luke and I were second choices. All I had to do was not let him notice my mistrust. The hotel had 11 floors, a small lobby, a kitchen, an inside pool, and a conference hall. The kitchen was locked, so we decided to check out the conference hall next. With a sinking feeling inside my stomach, I opened the big white door. What the? Lee whispered. We were standing in front of a long table with chairs all around it. At the very top, across from us, sat Luke, tied to a chair. He was wearing a purple blazer. His head was tilted to the side as if something was wrong with his neck. There was blood on his face. Lee tried to grab my arm, but missed it as I ran across the room to my brother. Luke, his head slowly moved back to normal. When he saw me, his eyes opened wide. Then his gaze went over to Lee, and he shook his head. Then out of here, he croaked. Oh man, I heard a different voice shout. At first, I couldn't tell who it was, so I looked at Lee, who I thought was the only other person in the room. But then I realized that there was someone else here who had been standing next to the door with a tape recorder in hand. Jacob. Oh my god, Max, we're filming a scene right now. You screwed it up. He had a smile on his face, but his eyes seemed angrier than I'd ever seen them before. No, I whispered. Then I noticed that he was holding something in his other hand, a hunting knife. Did you hurt Luke with that? I asked. He nodded, like a proud boy. Jacob was almost as tall as Luke, and could seem crazy intimidating if you didn't know that he was actually super sweet. Normally, his eyes were opened wide as sweat was going down his forehead. Only a little bit. He's totally fine. Where's Ellie? I asked, looking at Luke. For a split second, I saw the devastated look on his face and thought of the worst. She'll be right back, Jacob whispered, his eyes twitching for a split second. Anyway, you and your cousin, especially your cousin, are more than welcome to join us, he asked while moving the knife around. I looked at Lee, who was still standing at the door. He could have run away, but he didn't. Instead, he was making eye contact with me, and from what I interpreted, it looked like together we can take him. But before we could move, we started hearing the sound of heels walking on the wooden floor. They stopped right behind Lee. A woman started caressing his cheek with long, black nails and Lee lost all the color in his skin. She was wearing a checkered jacket, denim pants, and purple shoes. In her left arm, she was holding Ellie. My eyes opened wide. The woman smiled. "Hello there," she said in a playful tone. "Give her to me, please," Luke begged. The woman walked past Lee and towards the table where she took a seat on the right side next to Luke. Ellie reached out her arms when she saw him, and my heart broke a little, but at least she seemed fine. She was smiling and didn't have a single scratch on her. "Come on in, Lee. We have a lot to discuss." He walked towards me, and together we sat down on the left side of the table. It felt surreal, like we had just joined a regular work meeting. Jacob followed and sat down next to the woman. All of us were suddenly eerily calm, except for Jacob, who still had that insane look on his face. "Alright, let's get straight to the point. I was personally asked to take charge of the reboot of Dr. Worley's Adventure Club, and I have a proposition for you boys." I swallowed. "You're the new producer, huh?" Lee asked casually. "What happened to the old one?" "He is very busy, but he trusts me to do well with this task." "Right, and what's stopping us from punching you in the face and running off?" She shrugged. "Nothing, I wouldn't stop you, so no need to punch me. I am giving you an opportunity right now to start a conversation with us. As you know, we get what we want, and we will always find you again. What I'm doing now is giving you the opportunity to get the little girl out of here. We're not interested in her." "How?" Luke asked, slowly coming back to his senses. "I don't need all of you. And, believe it or not, I don't want you guys to hate us but join us, which I realize won't happen if we keep the babe. So I'm letting one of you leave with her. The other ones stay at the hotel with me and talk. That's it." She gave us a big smile. "I will leave the room and let you discuss, though I expect an answer when I get back." She got up from her chair, walked over to our side, and gave Ellie to me. Then she gestured something towards Jacob, who got up and left the room with her. I gave Ellie a kiss on her head, and then gave her to Luke, who hugged her tight. "There are no windows or other doors. We can't get out of this room," Lee said. I carefully touched Luke's face, where the blood was starting to dry. "Jacob did this to you?" He nodded. "You know, we were wondering if watching the tapes did anything to us, but I didn't even think about the fact that Jacob had seen parts of it too." I swallowed. "Luke, are you normal?" I asked. "I don't know, man. I'm not sure what normal feels like anymore. I think it's safest if you don't trust anyone." "I agree," Lee chimed in. "So what do we do?" For the first time, I was sure of what needed to happen. "Luke, you go. You take Ellie and get yourself to a hospital. I will listen to what the producer has to say." "Max, no way." I put my hand on his shoulder and leaned in closer. "We've been cursed since the first moment, Mom, and Dad got involved in all this. But we're adults now. Ellie isn't. Get her out." I started remembering Lee and Alex, and I now know what my mother did. Before I ran away, before I watched the show, I was brought to the auditions. My parents had a big argument. My mother was shouting that I was too fragile, but my father shouted back that Luke was too old. "He won't be harmed. He will be a star." After the fight, Mom came to my room. She picked the clothes I would wear, combed my hair, and even put some makeup on my face. "We have to make a good impression." She smiled at me, but I knew she wasn't happy. Something was going on. I had forgotten all of that, but now it was coming back. Parents weren't allowed inside for the auditions. They had given us all a sentence, put us in front of a camera, and filmed how we said it. I don't remember much more, only that a number of children were filtered out. 2 girls were picked for the female roles. For the male ones, there were 3 boys left. I didn't know who they were back then, but now I realize it must have been Alex, Lee, and me. That's where things got really messed up. 2 of us were supposed to be chosen for the show, and I think I had a pretty good chance. But then something happened. My mother killed me, and memories came back in little chunks, which I assume had something to do with how the following day went. Because now, 15 years later, Lee and I were back at the auditions. It wasn't easy, but Luke left. Lee instructed him not to go to any authorities about this. He said it would make things even harder for us. He promised we would be fine as he knew how to deal with them. The producer sent us to different hotel rooms to rest for the following day. We were on the 11th floor, and our doors were locked from the outside, but we realized we could communicate by opening our windows. Our rooms were right next to each other. I don't know what will happen to us now, but can we be honest with each other? I asked, sitting on the window ledge. Lee was silent for a moment. Yeah, he finally replied. Why did you tell them where we are? What? The producer, you sent them our location. Lee huffed. No, I didn't. I'm pretty sure it was Jacob. Genius. Right, but I saw the text. I protested. Yeah, that wasn't to the producer. It was still dumb. And risky though, he sighed. Sorry, I should have told you. Remember how I said that I didn't know where Alex was? A while back he just disappeared. No contact. Nothing. I sent that text to another friend that went through the Worley madness with us. This will sound weird, but I guess everything does at the moment. The Worley people have a way of creating new versions of us, like on the tapes. No, worse, those versions are real. They look like us, at least from a distance. They are more messed up, uncanny, and they can manipulate us. If you saw messed up tapes from your childhood, it might possibly not have been the real you. Anyway, I warned my friend that it could happen again. I wanted to make sure that, whatever happened, she knew that it was me. My head started hurting, but weirdly, it made sense to me. Maybe after all I'd witnessed in those days, things couldn't surprise me anymore. Do you think your friend can help us? No, she's on the other side of the world right now. That's the only reason I texted her. Wouldn't have involved her otherwise. But in case something happened, I wanted her to have our last location. I swallowed. For a second I had a bit of hope, but it was quickly taken again. Can you be honest with me as well? Lee asked. I nodded, which I realized he couldn't see, but he continued anyway. Your parents killed mine, didn't they? After everything I've learned about them, I think it might be possible. After that, we both closed our windows. I only slept for an hour or two that night, though as I was lying in bed, it felt as if I was living somewhere in between the wake and the dream world, and that's where the memories came back more detailed. The auditions. The three of us were sitting in a colorful room on small plastic chairs, surrounded by toys that we were too old for already. Lee was really chatty and seemed incredibly fun back then. Neither of us knew that we were cousins, but we got along well. Alex was quieter, but had something very cool about him. I remember that now. Hanging out with them was fun. I don't think any of us were feeling competitive. After a few hours inside that waiting room, they asked us back to the studio. Again, our parents were nowhere to be found. Most of the lights inside the studio were turned off, but I could see that they had built a set. The ground felt like a sponge. Every step we took was like a little jump. Alex was giggling until the voice of a man welcomed us. Next to him stood two other boys. I couldn't see a lot, but they had much resemblance with Lee and Alex. Max, the producer, said you did a wonderful job. However, at this time we can't consider you for the show. You will meet your mother in the parking lot. That was it. Lee and Alex said goodbye to me, but their voices sounded different. Scared. While I was sad that I wouldn't be joining them, I still felt relief. Opening the door of the studio and getting out, I remembered that my bag was still inside the dressing room, where I was brought at the very beginning, so I walked there first. And that's when I saw the corpses. There were multiple bodies lying on the ground. They had been cut open, and a purple substance was leaking from them. The substance made me believe that they were props, so with a beating heart I went to inspect them further. And that's when I realized that they all looked like me in different years of my life. One of them, the biggest one, was wearing the same clothes I was wearing that day. At first, I thought it was cool. I was 13 and believed they had created them for the show. But then I noticed that one of them was slowly moving his hand. I stumbled back towards the door and started running. I didn't stop until I found my mom's car. The drive home felt like a fever dream. You will forget about this soon enough, my dear. It will be like a dream. Your father would have been proud if you made the cut, but I believe your cousin will do just fine. The producers will be happy. She kept staring right ahead, hardly blinking at all. I noticed the purple blood splatters on her skirt, but I didn't ask her about it. At home, she played her part well, crying her eyes out because they chose Lee instead of me, acting like she was disappointed because we couldn't be a bigger part of the production. But now I believe that for a little while, she slipped out of the manipulation and saved me, or at least won some time. Those memories had been buried somewhere deep inside of me, but now they felt crystal clear, especially after what Lee had told me about the copies. A knock on my hotel door brought me back to the present. I opened it and some worker gave me a tray with breakfast. I asked them questions, but received no answers. An hour later, there was another knock. The same person brought me and Lee downstairs to the room with the swimming pool. When they opened the door, we heard the sound of a familiar sounding jingle. Lee clenched his fist. "There you are." The producer lady welcomed us, but I didn't even look at her. I was overwhelmed by the strange surroundings. I'd seen indoor pools before, but they had changed everything about it. The room was lit with gray and blue lights. Inside the pool was a dark substance that appeared sticky. Around it, they had created fake bushes and trees. There were cameras running the entire time. Besides the producer, there were a few workers, all dressed in the same overalls. One of them was Jacob. "We are so excited to create a new audition tape with you. However, our new concept will be a one-man show. For this reason, we would like to estimate in advance who our new star will be. We only want the strongest one, the best." The acoustics in the room made it sound like she was everywhere around us. I will be completely honest, neither of you was our first choice. We believed to have the best one secured, but he is not currently in our possession. In your possession. What the hell is wrong with you people? Lee shouted. Even through the bad lighting, I could see that she was rolling her eyes. Anyway, whoever pushes the other one into the pool first wins. You will both be handed the same weapon to keep things fair. Two of the assistants walked over and handed each of us a knife. My stomach started turning. You want us to fight? This is ridiculous. Neither of us wants to do this. Lee looked at me, but I couldn't make eye contact. My body was trembling. "I will do it. I'll be your star or whatever. Just let Max go," he said, surprising both me and the producer. She started laughing. "How very brave of you, but this is not how it works. We need to see who is better." I moved a step closer to the pool and looked at the substance. My sneaker touched the edge, and the fabric immediately started to melt. "You want one of us to kill the other," I whispered. "What if we don't do it?" Lee asked. "We will push both of you in and use one of our spares. We still have the option of a girl, and your brother, of course." I swallowed. There was no way I would kill Lee, but having us both dead wasn't an option either. The timer started ringing. "Go on," she shouted. Lee and I looked at each other, both frozen. I was sure that if it came down to it, he would do it, but he stood still. I took the knife and cut it inside my palm. Blood started trickling down. Real, red blood. Lee saw what I did and copied me. His blood was also red. We exchanged another look, and as if reading each other's minds, started running towards the producer. Before I could do anything, Lee had rammed his knife into her stomach. Purple goo started dripping. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, I took my knife and slit her throat. Workers started running towards us from all directions. This was our end. They would kill us both, and that's when my surroundings turned black. When I opened my eyes again, I was looking at an unfamiliar face. Slowly, I was coming back to myself and saw my surroundings. Lee was lying next to me, awake, but just as confused, and Jacob was there, unconscious and tied up. We were inside a moving van. "Alex," he whispered as the stranger smiled and hugged him. Suddenly, I felt wide awake and looked at the driver. Next to him was a baby seat. "Luke, you didn't think I would let you die in there, did you?" I couldn't comprehend the situation. Tears started forming in my eyes. I didn't believe I would ever see them again. Alex started speaking. "A lot has happened in the past year, something I will tell you all about. I was trapped for a long time, but recently found a way out. Of course, I had to stay hidden. The only person who knew where I was my mom. And yesterday, Helen called her. I didn't know what was going on, so I just drove to the location you had sent. That's where I met Luke. He was on his way to go in with a gun." "Great plan, Luke," Lee mumbled. "Yeah, I wasn't exactly thinking straight. Alex had a much better plan. We used gas to knock everyone inside out. I suppose we were just in time." "Well, you said getting out won't help us," I said to Lee. "It didn't. Not really, but we want some time. I have a place where we will be safe for a little while." Alex answered for him in a stern tone. "A friend will be waiting for us there." "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked Luke. "I don't know. They just disappeared. We got out of hell, but I believe I left a part of me in there. So for now, we might be safe. But as I understood after getting to know Lee better, there is no getting out of this anymore." As we reached the town of Fearway, I realized that this was only the beginning for me, especially as we took Jacob with us.